building up this intuitive guide for design for millennia. So, how do we do that? How do we know? What is it about a certain environment or space that either pleases us or displeases us, attracts us or threatens us? So, it was a quick experiment I did, you guys might remember last semester, where I can just sit down, look at a grid of photos, and just mark on your sheet with a red dot or a blue dot 3 environments that were pleasing and 3 that were irritating. So, I learned a few things in the results. Like Professor Hurt loves architecture. Put about 7 different scenes, and also designed it work, which is nice. But what it did was it verified that curiosity that I mentioned earlier, which was something that I've been involved in for about 6 years or so in archaeology. And that is, why are we drawn to architectural ruins? Why is it this universal phenomenon? Why do we travel around the world to see them? And take photos with them. And bring our priests to see them too. We used to build them in our backyard. What was that all about? The Germans came up with a word for it. Why are we writing books about it, saying that it's a pleasurable experience? More interestingly, how does it elicit an emotional response? It was here in Turkey on the side of a hill at a site that I work on that I first observed this response, and I've been wondering about it ever since. So my questioning on the ruin led to a much deeper and more complicated research, and that's particular to the field of modern neuroscience. So researchers are starting to map the brain and determine what's really going on. What are the connections? How are we interpreting buildings and environments? And they're starting to find some interesting things that I think architects and designers should know about. Now there's a group that is sort of leading this research and trying to focus it and share it with the world. And they're the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture and at the Salk Institute in La Jolla. And essentially, the group, they get together every once in a while. They have annual conferences. They've had a few so far where they share their work. Neuroscientists and architects come together and they share their work. So recently I went and saw the Sculpting the Architectural Mind where they went to Pratt. And Dr. Michael Arby basically said the group is a bunch of neuroscientists and architects learning how to talk to one another. And see, the conversation doesn't always go so well. So I just want to do a brief case study to show you guys how these two things interact, and I think it provides a good lesson in how to do this. So in 2006, most environmental meta found that humans prefer curved visual objects, regardless of age, culture, demographics, and the results have been repeated hundreds of times, hundreds of ways. Which isn't surprising because right angles didn't really exist where our brains evolved. I was thinking Frank Gehry, but hold on a minute. A follow-up study provided different results where, in a context of trying to find your way through a space, for example, in a hospital setting, the amygdala was triggered, which is our threat detector. Because we're trying to find our way in a curved environment, you're not going to be able to do that. So the point why I bring that up is that you can't really take these findings at face value. I think that it's a new science and that it might be interesting what we learned, but we have to take it with a grain of salt, and there needs to be a conversation back and forth. So what I propose is, rather than an Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, one that's more like an Academy of Neuroscience and Architecture, where it's more about the conversation between the two, and the two groups working together. And I think there's an architectural solution for that in a research incubator where the two groups can come together and work together side by side rather than just meet their own spot. So in searching for a site, I was drawn to a ruin, particularly this one, the Smallpox Hospital on Roosevelt Island in New York City. So I went there looking for a ruin, but what I found was much more than that. this is a point cloud model that I scanned on site. Thanks to David Cronrath, who just recently bought the equipment for our work. So right next door to this room is this architectural phenomenon. It's Lucan's last work, a monument to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's becoming a huge tourist attraction, and it's very interesting and exciting space. It's very unique. I found that the ruin is fenced off because it's actually unstable. It's not able to be accessed. I found a very interesting park setting, South Point Park, where the ruin is located. Very dense plant life, animal life. A varied topography. There's this large mound here on one side. Off in the corner, there was this existing historic building, which is Strecker Memorial Laboratory. It was the first center for pathological medicine in the country. And now it's being used as an MTA substation. And I also found this hospital, which is being demolished for Cornell Tech campus to come in on site, which is basically the equivalent of 5 Manhattan City blocks of innovation and research campus that's coming in on the island as part of New York City's Applied Sciences program, where they're trying to get as much money into the city as possible for research and innovation. So I thought, what better site than this, with such a rich diversity of environmental types and phenomena, for a group to come in and research how we react to different environments. So, in designing for the site, the first thing I had to consider was this connection to Cornell Tech's proposal. So, these are a pair of buildings that they're proposing, and this is the north wall. It's just a fence to the south of the park. These are the existing pedestrian access points on either side. This is Manhattan to your left, and this is to the right. That's right. And they're proposing what they're calling a tech walk that sort of awkwardly just fizzles out at the end of the site. So vehicular access also comes in, and there's service entry there that shares the same pedestrian path, which is a little problematic. So in reshifting the site, I've decided to bring Cornell Tech's tech walk right into the site and make a new entry to South Point Park and a designated service entry on the east side. From there, it was a matter of locating these two buildings on the site. The first of which is a research incubator, which is essentially a space where neuroscientists or architects can come and rent space and work side by side. The incubator typology is becoming very popular. It's a co-work space. So I placed it in a way that uses the existing Strecker Memorial Laboratory and sort of echoes that and comes off of it. And the result is a 2-story bar building that runs north-south on the island with the new entry here. So the public access is here with the reception area. And then as you move through the space, you reach a social area for breakout space. 3 bays of incubator, free work plan, and then capping out with another social space. So I should mention that a few of these design principles that I found from neuroscience, I've tried to apply here as sort of the first attempt. One of which is an idea called neurogenesis, which is our brain's ability to make new neurons and cells as we grow older. And it depends on what's called an enriched environment. And there isn't really a clear definition for enriched environment for humans yet. For lab rats, it's like colorful tunnels and toys and stuff. But in my opinion, one of the things that really enriches a place is people, right? Like the people that you share it with. One of the moves in the plan is capping all that incubator space with the social breakout area so that you can't get to your workplace without first seeing somebody you know. And then I should mention that in terms of neuroscience equipment, that's where I've decided to place all of that in an isolated way in the Strecker Memorial Lab. So reworking the plan of that a little bit to include on the ground floor a virtual reality room, that's how neuroscientists are studying our reactions now in a controlled way. And then on the second floor, it's these three incubator spaces again with a more presentation style one in the center. And then in the cellar floor plan, a gym and a bath suite. So another factor for enriched environment is physical exercise. So I've decided to give the researchers a facility to do that. So it's kind of an unorthodox move, but it highlights a piece of this research that we're finding out and expresses that. So just swing around and see the building in elevation. Here. And in sections, so you can see these double height spaces. So also corresponding to social space with the most amount of natural daylighting is another principle from chronobiology that all has. But the key here is the cellar connection to the Strecker lab. So there's no connection above ground, but there is one below ground in case you need to pass. There wouldn't be a whole lot of daily passage between the two because this is a more concentrated work area. It's a little bit more quarantined, while this is very open, just talking ideas kind of space. Now, there's another piece of this program that usually goes with research facilities, which is a more private study area. So if you think about Salk Institute and the new Sanford Consortium, they always include some sort of isolated area for private study. So I've taken that idea and used it as a sort of vehicle for research at the same time. So what I'm calling Blackwell Tower, which is named after the first family. And I placed it up on the mountain in the most resilient location. And the piece of research I wanted to test here has to do with the way we navigate and find our way around the environment. So part of what neuroscientists and architects are speaking about now is sort of developing an empirical architecture. So one where architects can develop a hypothesis and then build it and test it and see what happens, basically. And they see that as a way of moving forward and finding more research. So I thought this would be an interesting way to test our ability to navigate and make maps of space. So it's really interesting the way this works. Basically what we do in our brains is we leave breadcrumbs, right? And once we leave them, as we walk around, we assign a neuron in our brain to each one of those, and that gets fixed. So as you walk around, you hit that spot, the neuron fires, it tells you where you are. It's basically like built-in GPS. But what's really interesting is that we do that in a grid of equilateral triangles. So you're actually mapping this space right now in triangles. So that led to all these questions. I was like, well, what determines where those points are? Is it this because there's something on the floor? Is it there? Is it just random? How does that pan out in 3 dimensions? Is it just a floor? What about in the city where you're going up and down all the time? In a multi-tiered environment, are we really mapping in 3 dimensions? So I thought, that's my hypothesis. Why not use this tower, which is also isolated, as a way to test that hypothesis? So in the design of the floor plan, it's basically a square tower, but I've inset a hexagon into it. So my theory is that architecture can reinforce that mapping. or determine or play with it, or we can see what happens. So on the points of this hexagon, I've placed the openings to adjacent rooms in the second level, thinking that the threshold is the most drastic experience, and seeing if that can reinforce our mapping ability. And then repeating that on the first floor. So do we map in 3 dimensions? Do they line up? On the second floor, rotating it and placing the furniture where someone might work in private on those points. Then what about when the floor plate changes and the spaces change, but that hexagonal grid stays the same? Does that matter? What happens if there's 2 of them rotated? Does one take priority? And then what if it doesn't exist at all, but rather thin ceiling and skylights? So what about the room? I haven't really figured out what it is that draws us to ruin, but I found some interesting things that I think help explain it a little bit. So about 10 years ago, a pair of researchers in Italy found, by studying a monkey, what's called the mirror neuron. And the study went that they were trying to find how the monkey responded to picking up an object, when they pinched it, when they grabbed it. And at one point, the researcher was moving the experiment around, the monkey was still hooked up, and the monkey watched the researcher grab, and the neuron fired. And they found this mirror neuron system, which is basically our ability to see something and empathize with it. And I think that that's kind of what we feel for ruin. When we look at ruin or inhabit it, we see ourselves in it and realize that we're part of something bigger. And we empathize with them in a way. I'm still working on it. So, in approaching the room, I thought, from my own experience, this response was strongest not when you're just walking around looking at a ruin, but when you're actually in it. So, looking at the way it's currently reinforced, there's 4 steel towers and corners. I decided to take that reinforcement and sort of turn it inwards to stabilize what's an existing sort of dark space. So basically what I'm trying to do is identify all of these different spatial types throughout the ruin and focus on those for preservation as a way of enriching this research agenda on site. So here you take the neuroscientists, the architects, something we've never studied before. Here are all these different ways you can study it. So moving through the ruin, I've just tried to identify what those spaces were. So there was the dark room. There's this large open space for gathering. So what is it like when we gather in public around the room? There's essentially this path that comes through where there's a space that the sky opens up. So what does that do to us? Does that enhance the experience? An area where we can have more contained preservation, where we can get closer and actually touch the room. An existing octagonal oculus, where you can center yourself in the room and be framed by it. Does that have an effect? An area where part of the building is preserved, but it's open so that you can see a view of Manhattan. So does that contrast between ruin and modernity have an effect? And then looking at the south wing of the room, what if we did preserve it? What if we let it collapse and experience it over time as it changed? So by removing the 2 steel towers from this part of the room, allowing this just to be a space that people wander in over time, it also relieves the tension between the existing 4th floor part and that south face of the room. So that's essentially the conclusion to the presentation. What I'd like to just close with is that I think there's a certain responsibility in studying something like neuroscience. It shouldn't be something that's taken lightly in a way, because we're finding very deeply rooted things about ourselves, and there are already sorts of exploitations of it, like neuromarketing. People are figuring out how they can sell us stuff better by the way our brains work. So I think we should just try to take an opposite approach and see this thing responsibly moving forward. So I should mention another part of the landscaping brings visitors straight through that. And the effect is that you now come out on axis with the monument rather than skirting around the ruin as if it were an obstacle. So, any questions?
How do you propose to measure
Good question.
Because you've asked a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. So the way this technology is moving now, the brain mapping technology is becoming wearable and mobile. So a lot of architects are pushing for that mobility to take people out of the site and be actually in a place that they build, and then record measurements and see what happens there. The problems with that are there's a lot of noise as you walk around. It's a very sensitive piece of equipment. And as you blink, as you move your head, it has noise in the results. So they're working on that now. That's one way to do it. Another way, I think, is because there are still people that you can't really let out into the environment. Like, so, for example, somebody with severe amnesia or some sort of disorder. And that's why I still think you need this like a more isolated, controlled environment where you simulate a space using something like point cloud modeling that's a little more realistic and measure someone's response in a controlled way that way.
Would it be possible to take that kind of measurement and compare architecture? So for example, compare the experience of something, if you had something that was a control thing, so for example, a religious experience, right? Attending a religious service in one kind of building versus another kind of building. Would it be possible to measure which building has, I guess, a more sophisticated or stimulating or emphatic response? So in other words, you could say, if you did a building with a flat roof and it was a religious ceremony versus a building with a vaulted dome or something, you would be able to know what, presumably the people would be the control set, you'd be able to know which group had the more, I suppose, heightened, in a sense, religious experience.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's something to think about because I think it's just a matter of isolating as many variables as you can because everybody has their own conditions that they deal with as well. So I think something like a religious experience is very culturally rooted and something you learn over time. So it'd be a tough one to measure. But one thing I was trying to do at one point was to create data from space in a graphic way so that, because neuroscientists use EEG waves and all these bio levels, but then at these conversations they have at conferences, architects, it goes right over their head. And then architects speak about space and the neuroscientists, they roll their eyes. So the idea here was to bring data to both sides. So what I did, I set up a little experiment where I had a control and I said, here's a square room, here's a tighter square, here's a round room. And the idea might be that a neuroscientist could take that, overlay with EEG levels, and see what they get.
I'm just wondering, though, in the sense that the survey that you used was a preferential survey, the one you gave to the faculty and so on here. But what you're, in a sense, looking at here is experiential measurement, which harks back to people like Gordon Cullen and so on, how they try to identify that and try to record it and so on, as you pass through space, which has been a part of what you've been talking about. A lot of the the experimentation that's going on in the workplace right now is getting away from rooms, enclosed space, to open plan, to create the stimulus and the social interaction. And the spatial aspect of it kind of goes away in favor of the social interaction and so on in the creative process. How do you see that using a very deterministic architecture leads to gaining the kind of information you're interested in achieving? There's a very specific form here that you're working with.
In the proposal for the building?
Right.
Right, yeah, I think my biggest goal was just to provide a space where that social interaction could occur, because from what I found, that was really all that mattered. And in terms of how architecture enforces, in terms of its form, hasn't really been
Well, then
explored.
wouldn't you want to create a laboratory in which you could create all types of different simulations of spatial relationships or social relationships and so on,
Yeah.
to
That-
really
yeah.
test that?
Yeah, I think in terms of setting up like an empirical architecture, right, something we can test through, that would be an interesting approach. But for the Sanford Consortium, the Stem Cell Research Center they just built next to Salk, there was neuroscientists and architects working together to design it. And they really didn't get much further than we need social breakout spaces so that we can interact because we understand things like neurogenesis. And another problem they did was they didn't measure their activity before they moved into the new building, so they couldn't compare.
No benchmark.
Yeah. So I think that's what they're trying to make sure they do moving forward. If they design a new facility that's supposed to be geared toward cognitive development, to try to measure a group before they move in.
So what are you looking, is it performance? Is it efficiency? Is it experiential quality? What do you see as the outcome of this kind of research?
I think genuine well-being. I think that if you look at the most developed parts of the world, they're the most statistically depressed, right? The diseases of civilization, suicide. There's a lot of mental illness going on in cities. And I think part of it has to do with it not being sympathetic enough with the way our brains have evolved. So that's sort of my outcome is I think that's positive. I think it might be cool, why we like the golden rectangle and all these things, but if it's not genuinely improving your life, it shouldn't be brought up as a question. So I think in the navigation tower, I think setting up different hypotheses of how we actually map in 3D could help people feel less anxious in a high-rise tower. If we understand that a high-rise tower should have this hexagonal grid within it, then it might help the people in that building.
So the question comes you had shown those different hypotheses. One of the things you said is, how will you feel when you're in dark or in light? And you said also in the first opening statement, how we love nature, and nature has curves. So there are two contradicting things here when I see that proposal, and I'm thinking, why is it rigid? And why is nature not there? And number two is, we are in 21st century, where is my light? We have so much artificial light and natural light. How have you even looked into that, or is it down the road?
Yes.
How do you do it? Because it is a lab. It needs to function 24/7. So any of these?
Yeah, definitely things to further look into, but I did consider that, the idea that we prefer curved contours in the environment. But rather than take that as, a kind of morphic formed building, I thought, why not have the circulation of the building clear so that people know where they are at all times, and used brick groin balls, right? So maybe the structure and the form that encloses you could start to take on that curvilinear.
But where this would have interesting resonance would be in studying the effects of environment on workplace, which a lot of interior firms do, right? So you could actually make that building into kind of a loft building, and then you call somebody like Steelcase up and you say, we're going to rent this building for 2 years to this firm, and every 6 months or 4 months we're going to change the interior layout, right? So instead of partitions this high, they're going to be this high. Instead of operable windows, they'll be closed windows. And that you would then be able to measure whether or not creativity and productivity, it had an impact. I'm just trying to think about how you would, the workplace thing is the thing I see the most resonance in this, because there are people now saying that access to senses, light obviously has been pointed out, but also touch and smell and breezes and things like that, have a positive stimulatory effect on the brain and creativity. And you would look at somebody like a kind of Steelcase and you could say, well, what are the different ways you could do 100 people working here, and what are the different kind of layouts? And then you would measure, somehow what their reaction to those layouts would be. In which case, I think you would make a building, in my view, that was flexible to be able to totally kind of look at all that stuff and say, well,
kind of morphs.
And morphs as, and maybe sometimes there are more curvilinear office layouts, and maybe sometimes there are less curvilinear.
Because the word incubator to me is incubating something, and we don't know what it's going to come out, kind of. And that's why I feel like that rigid form is kind of limiting you. And maybe somewhere in that building, something which, I don't know, like something what you have in the ending of your presentation. It's not come up there yet. It could be whatever the person who's going in, I think will be much positive to your project.
I think, though, say first, the extraordinarily beautiful presentation at every kind of level and at every dimension, graphically and verbally and visually, the pace of your presentation. I think it's great. I think you were right that this is an extraordinarily rich site because of the various and contrasting components it has, and I think you were very good in handling the landscape kind of gingerly, developing the edges and leaving it pretty much as it is. I think the idea of the ruin as a foyer to the memorial is absolutely wonderful for the contrast. And, I don't know how much it relates to your thinking. I've always thought ruins had both an emotional and intellectual aspect to them. Intellectual, more often in dealing with sites or ruins that are more difficult to read, their legibility, what you're really seeing and how you turn it into something else. Here you've got more than less, so I don't think it's as much that. But the other is just pure emotional, and I think that has to do with pure pleasure of a ruin in a landscape. And I think, and I like the way you treated it, that one of the revelations, the simple things that occurred to me at some point, I don't know what it was, we were working on an ancient site in Cyprus, and it was kind of turning things inside out. That is, when we think about buildings, we typically think about them as the permanent things, the landscape is transitory. But if you step back in time, really the opposite is true. The buildings are transitory, the landscape is really the permanent thing, because the landscape always comes back and reoccupies the site. So I love the idea that this continues to ruin, to go into ruin, and the landscape takes up. So I think it's a beautiful kind of piece of the whole project. The thing I find that puzzles me, and it builds a little bit on the idea of light and flexibility, but more for me it's opacity. I think that the extraordinary thing about the Leonardo sectional perspective and these things that you're doing are the whole idea that everything that's happening inside here has always been hidden, and to open it up and see it is the most beautiful thing about what he did or what's going on now. So the idea that these buildings are so opaque, so solid, apart from the space they make inside, the image they project from the outside, I would have thought that the strategy here would be transparency in every respect and contrast. I think, for instance, would have been much more interesting to me if rather than trying to develop something that seemed so kind of compatible or building on that this would have been strongly contrasted to that. And then an entirely different vision, pure transparency and light, and that you would see things going on inside, and it would reflect this idea of taking the skull away. And I think the same of your tower, just, you know, it looks like fortress-like. Corners closed, largely opaque. That's where I found what I didn't understand. Everything else, I think, here is very, very beautifully done, beautifully thought out. But the architectural expression surprised me.
Sure. I will say one thing to that. I think it's something that it might be a remnant of earlier thinking on the project, which is that I wanted the building to make the statement that although neuroscience might seem like a new thing, and that the building should look like a new thing, that it's really rooted in ancient stuff, you know, and it's serious, and so that's, I think, where that came from, and it might not have dissolved enough. So,
Well, if we think of ruins as evolutionary,
yeah, I hear you.
if we think of ruins as being evolutionary, in a sense, and sort of statements of culture at a particular point in time, and so on, that whole process is a changing one also. What I'm struggling with a little bit, this is my own, and I agree with you, Michael, with the visuals and the way that it's presented is excellent, is how the brain develops in early childhood. And by the time you're 19 or 20 years old, your brain is basically 98% complete. And your learning process, in the sense of the brain development, has been solidified. The first 5 years are the fastest growth. And so that, what happens during that time in a person's life has more influence on who they are, what they're going to be, et cetera, and how their brain begins to function and so on. Once we get into adults, then we start to break it down into how do we find our way, how does our memory work. We're thinking about it in a much different way than, let's say, a creative way. We're trying to measure how it responds to things rather than how it develops to enhance creativity in that sense. So a lot of the stuff we're doing with office environments now is how can we stimulate what a lot of us experienced when we were toddlers and kindergartners, where the plan was open plan and you did activities that were not structured so much. When you got to high school, you sat in a very rigid environment generally, and our schooling was very much regimented in that sense. So I'm trying to see how is the importance here to measure adults in the sense about how they see things, or is it more about, in the sense, how we can creatively use our models and brains?
I think the direction I took the research was trying to identify the things that we all have regardless of the way we develop in early childhood. So I think we've evolved to have certain tools and mechanisms, right? Like the way we map. Everybody has that no matter what. So I think early on I wanted to focus on those things because once you get into how people develop, you have to deal with a lot more variable than that. So I thought if you're trying to design with the brain in mind, that we should at least first try to focus on the things that we know we all share and have in common. But I think there's really interesting questions about, how do you focus, or focus on developing places for children as they develop and trying to boost that even further.
I just want to congratulate you. Having had you as a student, knowing your thinking, and seeing how it's developed and where it's taking it, I think it's an incredible and bright way thesis. I think from both, you know, the theoretical and all the wide range of reading you did, and then your choice of site and how you intervened in that site, very, very close to what existing context, the different kinds of structures on the site, range of site responses and interventions. I think it's really beautiful. I also want to comment that your hypothesis that we empathize with ruins was actually said in 1903 by Alois Riegel in his essay, Modern Cultural Monuments. He said, we are drawn to ruins because we see in them signs of our own past. Right? So you have really good person and tradition to be building on there. I'll leave that speculation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about when you talked about how we dropped crumbs and that becomes kind of cognitive or memory map. I was wondering if you could say something about whether those crumbs also exist on the site and how you see those three pieces in relation to each other.
Yeah, I
And
thought,
the monuments.
right, I thought about that early on, like maybe I put the light posts, right, on that grid or something like that, but never quite developed.
Because it seems like it's there, and I was just wondering, to me, it seems
Yeah.
like there's a
Well, so-
procession of multiple pathways.
Yeah, that was definitely one way to take the thesis, was looking at the landscape as a whole as well as just the three structural venues. I think
How is it, how did that triangulation, how was that determined originally?
in the cognitive mapping that we do,
Yeah.
how is it determined, like how did they find that out?
Yeah, I mean, or,
So all these experiments occur with lab rats. So they put them in a maze, and at first, I think in the 70s, they found one cell type called a place cell that they just noticed that every time the mouse stepped on that spot, that cell fired. And then recently, they found another cell type called the grid cell that organizes all those place cells. So it's kind of like a multi-tiered process.
That's the Miesian cell.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, William White
Yeah.
did a number of studies about the social uses of spaces, and the triangulation theory is embedded in that as well.
Really?
About how we relate to people and to objects and to activity, etc., and how you need the socialization, even though you may not know the other person, but to be with someone else
Yeah.
and to have something that you focus on is all part of making the social spaces. It's fascinating because it's made us think about how the public spaces in cities work.
Yeah.
And how you can be much more effective in creating the vitality and other things that we look for in environments and so on.
Well, like Kevin Lynch, who had Image of City, that in his theory of mental mapping, landmarks, not necessarily within any kind of larger structure, but from a doorknob to an object, and certainly I think lots of capacity for mental mapping.
It's interesting. I think we're going to have to invent a thesis prize category called Best Use of a $35,000 piece of technology. But I think it's an interesting thing to talk a little bit about the technology here, because it is the LiDAR scanning that you did to present the thesis was really interesting. And I think it enables us to capture the sense of a landscape or a cityscape much more than flat drawings do, in our sense of movement through those spaces. And I think that you're onto something there in terms of how we describe the experience of space. And it's more than just making a movie from SketchUp, because you're able to look up and look down and get panoramas, and you can move through the space and things like that. And I think I'm glad you used it, because you've been the person who's been the sort of champion of bringing this technology to the school. And I'm glad you're using it something other than the Stavia project, but I'm looking forward to using it again with the Stavia project. But aside from that, I think the idea of being able to use it to describe these larger ideas of landscape and experience and to describe them in ways that are much more akin to how we experience them in the brain. And there may be some way, maybe some of these neuroscientists can look at that technology as well and use that to understand what sort of stimulation occurs when people look at that as opposed to looking at flat drawings.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, and specifically, let me just, I mean, I hope I'm still around when I get to go into, where did it go? That room right there. You know, that virtual reality room and participate in the kinds of experiences that you were asking about before, where you can in fact hold a whole bunch of variables constant and then introduce me to different environments and test out what those responses are and do that with a whole bunch of people. And furthermore, I hope I'm still around when that technology becomes commonplace in schools of architecture. Because I think in terms of, one of the things that I think is most difficult is actually building up our experience that we use and actually making design decisions. And having that capability and being able to, actually whether you have it available from the time the children are young, or whether you just have it available in places like School of Architecture, engineering schools and whatnot, is be fabulous.
yeah, we actually had one on campus,
Where are they hiding it?
the computer science division.
I figured, yeah.
But that's a great point because it's something I agree with. That if you look at they call them caves. It's with the VR rooms. The graphics they use in them is like very rudimentary. It's flat. You know, everything is like angled, dull. It's not. It doesn't elicit as much of a. So I agree. I think I'm proposing or going to submit this project to ANFA because they take work. And that's one of the big points I think I'm going to make is that you guys should be using this.
They, at Carnegie Mellon, through their entertainment technology, they have created a series of these spaces to simulate virtual environments. They're using it for gaming.
Yeah.
And simulation of other environments and so on. So that's another area in which similar experimentation. But they're black boxes. In a sense, it's like that room. You remove all of the stimulation from it.
Right.
Takes out all the fun.
You actually,
I know.
well,
Actually, I was going to ask about that. Have you, after you've done your thesis and done all this research, have you reflected on sort of ethical implications of all of this and how it will change how we go about designing things? Because you're suggesting a totally different way of approaching space.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely thought that. I presented stuff about that in meetings, yes, but I don't know how totally new it will be. I think a lot of it we just kind of know about now intuitively.
But then there's the issue about collection of data.
Yeah.
Data, follow data.
Yeah, there's a whole branch of neuroscience called neuroethics, which is what do we do with the data, who controls it, who gets access to it, and I think that's a huge point to keep in mind as people work with this stuff. But it's a good point because something I didn't mention that why I think it's important because but architecture is dictated by building code, right? And it's law and legislation, and typically we're not able to change legislation without some kind of empirical information. So if we could prove that building a city this way is actually detrimental to someone's mental health, then that can start to switch the code around and how we do things in that way.
I like the way you put in your cave into that section of the building, which was the dissecting feeder, right? The operating feeder. And in a sense, your new use is dissecting and understanding space in the same way in the 19th century. There were bodies being placed in there to dissect and understand these parts and the way it all works. I like that part.
Garth, would you like to say something?
I just want to be sure, did you want to add anything else to this?
I just want to say really thank you. And I thought many of the comments here were right on target, including the things that seem to be a mystery after all things are said and done. They stand as mysteries for me too, and I hope as you continue to reflect on the process itself, that those mysteries enlarge and become part of your ongoing quest. And I also want to start with the quest process. This thesis attracted me in the beginning, not because of the study you were trying to exhibit, but the questions you were posing about these relationships. Some of you don't know, but some of you do, that about 3.5 years ago I fell off a ladder at 20 feet height and crushed my head and found myself regaining consciousness in the hospital nearby, along with war vets and others who had experienced impact on their head. And I was invited to become part of a research project at NIH, and I'm still about 2/3 of the way through, where modeling physically the brain and testing my cognitive and perceptual capabilities throughout is become a fascinating subject to me. So when you told me you were after neuroscience and architecture, I thought, there's someone and I have a highly detailed three-dimensional model of my brain, and I'm watching it over time. I'm watching it deteriorate, and I'm the subject.
We are too.
Yeah, well, you're seeing the effects of its deterioration. But I mention this because there's something that loops back into this quite interesting, ironically. What happened with the damage, and I'm the subject of speculation by other academics who are gathered around.
Not just your colleagues.
Not just my colleagues. So they discovered that the area of impact in my brain is deteriorating more slowly than the area that was not affected by the impact.
Because you're rebuilding.
Because the rebuilding process, the regenesis process, is built strength. And that.
So what are you recommending?
So an occasional club over the head. So people, and I'm thinking of someone in particular.
It's already happened.
But I mention that because there's this relationship between the mechanism, the neural network, our repair process, and then this environment, which is an ongoing questioning environment, and what are we learning about it? And I love the question about, well, how are we going to know what's most fertile to learn? It feels, in the comments were, rigid. Where's the flexibility? Office space. I mean, we were all drawn to the sort of premises that we know tend to be fertile in work environments. And then I kept thinking, well, how is this work environment like or not like other work environments? And what might the researchers prefer? And then I started looking at the architecture more closely, and I thought, there's a curious contradiction between a sort of skull-like quality of the building and this sort of flexible neural network of an interior. That there's this way, it's actually extremely flexible on the inside, except for where the researchers are nested on one side. The stage set of what is studied and how it's studied is really quite open. The exception in the piece that's really most Kahn-like is this tower, right? And I kept thinking, was he fascinated with Lucan out on the open space? Because this is like a miniature medical center or something, where you're going to see this incredibly tight, solid, impervious kind of thing. And I just wonder if you really are reflecting about these what might be coincidences, but they might be subconscious allures to certain ideas that are resonant in the relationship between the active mind and the structure that activity depends on, the solidity of the structure, to permit the dynamism. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. This LiDAR thing is really kind of important, and you need to know that this guy not only has pioneered, mastered, and advanced this, but has been trying to pull it into the studio. There's a whole legion, by the way, of students here who use you as a mentor to use this. This tool has started to propagate itself throughout the studio because of what you demonstrated in your presentation about what it can do for us. I really felt, unlike in most any other thesis, I experienced where this is. I really know what it feels like to walk through it. So it's not just about animation, using this sort of pixelated universe to bring more evidence to bear. And I think that you're absolutely right to take this to this ANFA group and talk about the representational world physically and the perceptual, behavioral, interpretive world that's associated with it. Because I think that's where the real frontier is in this, and what I can imagine growing out of a setting like this where these kind of topics can be most fertile. The one thing you didn't mention that I wish you had, wait, one comment and one thing you didn't mention. What none of you see here, I'm going to sort of wink at my colleagues that are on your committee, witness. It was only about 4 weeks ago the party of the building actually settled down. I think most of us were anxious that this was going to be a written thesis alone. And I
was anxious it wasn't going to be that.
Oh, yeah. But there were so many including that early on, the whole thing was embodied in the ruin. And it's been all over the place, looking to Manhattan, made of all different kinds of materials, and it's still a mystery. It landed where it landed, but it landed quietly, kind of an outgrowth of the Cornell campus, and then nested in and speaking to this fragment of residue that was on the site. And Don's comment, I thought, was right on. This performing room, which was so significant in the middle of the original building, but a kind of ironic inversion of what the new room becomes in your thesis. I think that's the strength of the scheme, the discovery of these qualities, and then the tethering to them. But the embodiment is still a mystery. So last, I'll just say that it's really been a joy to work with you. You've got an ability to just take all kinds of hits, and just not be disrupted by it. I mean, I can see, an emotional response that you're good at subverting, but you just absorb stuff in, and your curiosity just keeps going. And I hope you find a way to exploit that curiosity, find a place where that curiosity will serve you and others who work with you well. Congratulations.
Please hold your applause. At 2 o'clock, we assemble here, facing that way. My brain is anywhere near as good as his. There will not be sunlight on that drawing, on that set of drawings at that time. Congratulations. I'm glad to have